Hello everyone and welcome to the Good Old Gamer. So here recently we've tested out the Core i5-2500K, the Ryzen 5 1600, and the Core i3 10100 CPUs to see how they fared in today's modern AAA single-player games. They all did pretty well. The 2500K did fall behind a little bit. I wouldn't say that it's an ideal gaming experience, but both the 1600 and 10100 fared very, very well. So luckily a viewer, so thank you Origin, he recommended that I try out the i7-3770K, and he had an extra one laying around that he sent over for testing. So that's what we're going to be checking out here today, if the 2012 Core i7-3770K is still good enough to run modern AAA single-player games here in 2021. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at here today. But before we get into it, if you like videos like this, please smash that like button. Please subscribe. Please share with friends. That tells YouTube that you guys like this type of content, and then they share it around a little bit more, and then our community grows. So that's really awesome. I want to thank all of you guys that do that on a regular basis. You guys are the unsung heroes of the channel. So as I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at the Intel Core i7-3770K. I have this CPU overclocked to 4.3 gigahertz, as 4.4 just didn't really want to go, which is a bit strange. I've never had an Ivy Bridge CPU not hit 4.4 before, but hey, you know, these things are starting to get old and maybe it's just the way it goes. So 4.3 gigahertz. And all the rest of the testing methodology will follow suit with the other videos. If you haven't seen, everything is run at 1080p because we're trying to be as CPU bound as possible. I used high and ultra settings on these games because, well, we're going to be using the RX 6700 XT, which is a 1440p, if not a 4K graphics card. So I figured most of you guys, if you're going to be pairing such a powerful GPU with such a CPU, you're going to crank up the settings, of course. So those are the settings that we used. And then in terms of the motherboard, I went ahead and used the Asus Maximus 4 Z68 Gene. It's a lot of numbers, so it takes me a second to catch up with all that. It's the same motherboard that we used with the i5-2500K. For cooling, I use the Vertu V5 120mm RGB heat pipe cooler. In my personal opinion, these are probably the best coolers that most people can get. If this isn't good enough to cool your CPU, then the CPU is doing something wrong. In my personal opinion, very affordable cooler. Got mine for 30 bucks. It's a great little guy. We use the same Crucial Ballistics DDR3 1600. This is CL9 memory, and this worked very well with the i5-2500K. I did not want to go with the 2133, as that's an unrealistic scenario. Most people that are still using a 3770K here today likely are using DDR3 1600. For the SSD, Kingston was kind enough to send over their KC600 1TB SATA 3 SSD. Went ahead and popped that in there. Worked great. And for the power supply, Sigotep was nice enough to send over their GF750 750 watt gold rated fully modular power supply. And I've been checking out Sigotep power supplies here recently, and they seem to be one of the best values out there. So I was really glad I was able to test this out, and it's working very, very well with this test system. And if you guys are interested in any of the rest of the specs, click down below in the description. I have links and everything. You can check it all out for yourself. So alrighty guys, let's start taking a look at some of these benchmarks and see how the 3770K still holds up here 9 years later. Alright, so kicking things off, we're going to be taking a look at Metro Exodus. And the 3770K has no problem. This actually seems to be a very well optimized game, as most of the CPUs don't have a problem running this game. We have an average FPS of 114 and the 1% low coming in at 78. So perfectly flawless experience in this game. Switching on over to Cyberpunk 2077, we come in with an average frame rate of 75 frames per second, with a 1% low of 48. 48 is a little bit low, but with a VRR FreeSync display, it's still going to keep you in the range. But once again, this is Cyberpunk, and, well, it's a bit jank. Now, moving on over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we get even more demanding, which I found a little ironic. I've said it many times, this is a very CPU-intensive sequence that I test, but we have the average frame rate coming in at 69 frames per second, with the 1% low coming in at 45. So we slipped a little bit further behind. This is really teetering on that line. Most FreeSync ranges will either be 40 FPS or 48 FPS. So if you have a display that has a 40 FPS FreeSync range, you're still okay. But if it's 48, might not even be playable, to be perfectly honest with you. Next up, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And, well, this is a much better showing. We have an average frame rate coming in at 90 frames per second, with a 1% low coming in at 57 frames per second. So this game, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, no problem. So that's kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting that. And then the last game is actually the poorest showing of them all. This is Watchdogs Legion, coming in at 57 FPS on average. So the first game that is sub 60 on average, with a 1% low of 41 FPS. So that is quite low. All right, so taking a look at all of that, we can tell that it's really getting to the end of the lifespan of something like a 3770K. That's with an overclock, so something like a 3770 non-K is going to struggle even harder. So I would say that here in 2021, for the majority of games, it's going to do the thing, especially with a VRR FreeSync display. Just to put things in perspective, let's compare it to the i3-10100, which is a $100-ish CPU here today. All right, so averaging out those 5 games, the 3770K comes in with an average frame rate of 81 FPS, which is very respectable, and a 1% low of 54 FPS. Once again, pretty solid with something like a VRR display. But now we compare that to a $100-ish CPU here today. That comes in with an average frame rate of 94 and a 1% low of 64 FPS. So that 1% low is really the big deal here because you're going to get an overall significantly smoother experience with the 10100. Now, I'm not recommending anybody out there with something like a 3770K upgrade to an i3-10100. The upgrade is minimal, but it's still there. Realistically, it might be time to start looking at something like a 6-core, 12-thread i5, like the 10400F. Those are going for like $170-ish. Not unreasonable. That's a pretty good price point. If you want to wait another generation or two, maybe we'll start seeing 6-core, 12-thread i3s around the $100, $120 mark. I mean, the CPU's lasted you this long, you might be able to squeak it out a couple more years. But honestly, I would say once we start seeing 9th gen games starting to come out, which should be towards the end of next year, those are games designed specifically and only for PS5 and Xbox Series X. Those games probably are not going to run very well anymore on a 3770K. Now, realistically, they might not even run very well on a 10100. However, all the games that we have out here today, or the more demanding single-player games today, they run fine on the 10100, whereas the 3770K, it's literally being pushed to the absolute maximum at this point in time. So I personally found this interesting. I thought the 3770K was going to be closer to the 10100 as the clock speed's a little bit higher. Obviously, IPC is lower, but I figured that it would be a little bit closer. I didn't think that Intel made that big of a jump by going to the Skylake architecture. So yeah, Skylake's still kicking pretty good. We know that it keeps up with everything out there. And if you are somebody who has an older, like a 2600K or a 3770K, or even something like a 4790K, those CPUs are really kind of at their end of life. The CPU I'd really recommend here today would be something like the 10400F. If you can get a Ryzen 3600 at a reasonable price point. I haven't seen them at reasonable price points here recently, but if you can, $200 or less is reasonable in my world. That would be a great upgrade. And then obviously with these platforms, you can go to higher core counts down the road if necessary. We do have Alder Lake coming up soon, and the 12600K seems like that's going to be a real good choice as well. That's going to be more expensive. It should be sub $300, I'm hoping. But that should probably last this entire console generation and possibly even further into the future. So if you want something that's going to game really, really good today and throughout, that might be the way to go. But if you want to save some money, I think the 10400 or Ryzen 3600 will probably cut the mustard as well. And if you're okay with sticking it out with your 3770K, it's still doable, but in some games, you're just not going to get that perfectly smooth experience that you may have wanted. No matter how powerful your graphics card is, that your CPU is just going to become the bottleneck more and more as we go down the road. But alrighty, guys, I found this pretty interesting. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Are you still using one of these old CPUs? Are you going to ride it out until Alder Lake, maybe Zen 4, get to that AM5 platform? It's actually not a bad reason to hang on to it, is to wait until you get to those newer platforms that'll last a lot longer. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down there in the comment section below. And that's all I really have for you guys here today. And I will catch you guys in the next video.